This presentation provides an overview of the coefficient naming conventions used in the GTAP model, version 7. This video is about naming conventions in the database that are consistent with the GTAP model, v7, which is also referred to as the Facelift version. We will explore the sets, base data, and parameter files using a 10x10 aggregation to illustrate the new nomenclature. This aggregation has 10 commodities, 10 activities, and 10 regions. Let's begin with the Sets.har file of the database. This is the main page of an example Sets.har file. Here, you will find a column of header names, as well as a column called name. The header names are only used by the GTAP model code as a location. The name column is more informative as this is where you'll find the formal name of the sets in capital letters, along with a description of the set. In this example, the header ENDM in row 8 is the location of the set called ENDWM, or mobile endowments, that'll be used in the database. The dimension column is also useful. For example, for the set and header both called reg, the dimension column tells us that the set has 10 elements. In other words, we're using an aggregation of the database that has 10 regions. The sets file will always contain the following. You will find reg, or reg, the set of regions, comm, or com, the set of commodities, act, or act, the set of activities, marg, or marg, the set of margin goods, and endw, the set of endowment commodities, or what we might call factors. These are the key sets that are used in the database. You will also see a number of sets that are either subsets or are related to these key sets. For example, ENDWT is a set that identifies the type of each endowment in ENDW, and ENDWS is the subset of endowments that are sluggish. In addition to the key sets that are used by the model and database, the Sets.har file also contains other information. These additional sets are not used in the database or model, but are there for informational purposes. You will find the sets drel and dver, which are not really sets, but only contain the version number, release date, and format of the database you are using. You may also find headers that end with the letter L. These headers provide the long descriptions of set elements if they were provided in the aggregation file. For example, if there was a header called H1 that contained the sets of regions, then H1L would contain long descriptions of those regions. The sets file also contains mapping information that describes how the disaggregated database was aggregated. For example, in this file, there is a header called mcom, which is the sectoral aggregation mapping. It has a dimension of 65, which means we're working with a database release that has 65 disaggregated sectors. These were aggregated to 10 sectors, giving us the set com with a dimension of 10. The header mcom describes how each of the 65 sectors in the original database were mapped to the 10 final sectors we have now. Now that you are familiar with GTAP sets, let's turn to the main data file of the database, which is called Basedata.har. On the main page, you will see several columns that provide detailed information about dimensions, coefficient names, numerical values, and descriptions of the value flows. Notice that the dimension column uses the same set names as were defined in the Sets.har file. Consider the example of header VMSB. We will see in just a bit that this is the value of imports. The dimension column tells us it has 3 dimensions, com, reg, and reg, which tells us that this contains flows for every traded commodity, from every region, and to every region. In other words, it is a bilateral flow for every sector. On this page, you will also see that the column called coefficient is populated. GTAP uses a 4-letter coefficient name to identify the various types of data in the database and model. These 4 letters follow certain conventions that are best seen through examples that we will see shortly. In this file, we begin with the most common type of data, or flows in GTAP, which relate to the purchase of goods within each region. These are identified as domestic or imported purchases, under the name column of your main page. To understand the coefficient naming convention for these types of flows, we'll run backwards through the 4 letters. The last letter of the coefficients will end with a B or P, where B indicates a purchase measured in basic prices, and P indicates a purchase at producer prices. The third letter will either be a P, F, G, or I, where P indicates the purchase was by the private household, F being by firms, G indicating a government purchase, or I being an investment purchase. The second letter will either be D or M, which tells us whether the good in question is domestic or imported. Finally, the first letter is almost always a V, which simply stands for value. Now let's look at a couple of examples. Consider the coefficient VMGP, which is the value of imported government purchases at producer prices. Similarly, VDPB is the value of domestic, private purchases at basic prices. Let's now turn to trade flows in the Basedata.har file. These are identified as exports, imports, or margins in the name column. In the case of trade flows, the convention is different. VFOB are exports measured in FOB prices, while VCIF are imports measured in CIF prices. For trade flows at basic prices, VXSB and VMSB are the corresponding exports and imports measured in basic prices. There are also additional trade-relevant headers that relate to trade margins. VST is the value of exports of trade margins, or exports of international transportation. VTWR is also the margins on international trade, but this is disaggregated bilaterally, as well as by sector. Let's now turn to taxes and subsidies in the database. Coefficients related to taxes end in the letters RV to indicate that this is a revenue, while the first 2 letters provide some helpful indication about the type of tax. For example, revenue from anti-dumping duties are contained in the coefficient named ADRV. The RV tells us it's a tax, and the AD helps identify that it's an anti-dumping tax. TFRV is another example, which is revenue from ordinary import duty, otherwise simply called tariffs. Hence we have a TF, which stands for tariff. Similarly, FTRV is revenue from factor taxes. Be aware though, that there are 2 exceptions to this convention. VMRT is also trade tax revenue, but instead of differentiating between types of taxes, it differentiates between types of tax instruments. PTax is another exception. This is taxes on output, or simply producer taxes. Finally, subsidy-related coefficients end with the letters EP. For example, CSCP are subsidies on intermediates. FBEP are factor-based subsidies. OSCP are output subsidies. And ISCP are investment subsidies. Let's now turn to flows related to endowments, also known as factors. Coefficients for these flows begin with an E for endowment, and the V for value is now in the second position. This helps differentiate flows of endowments from flows of goods. In this category, we have EVFP, which is the value of purchases of endowments by firms at producer prices. EVFB is the purchase of endowments by firms at basic prices, and EVOS is the supply of endowments. There are some remaining flows in the database that don't fall under any of the previous categories. We'll take a look at these now. We have 2 coefficients for make matrices. MAKS is the make matrix before taxes, while MAKB is the make matrix measured in basic prices. There are also capital-related coefficients. VDEP is the value of depreciation and VKB is the stock of capital at the beginning of the period. Population and the value of savings are also present. This covers all coefficient types that you may find in the database, consistent with the GTAP model, version 7. Let's now turn briefly to the parameter file. This is only relevant if you are using the model and not just the database. For parameters, the coefficient names are created as they might be spoken. The most common type of parameters are Armington elasticities. For example, the Armington elasticity for the allocation of domestic goods may be written in the literature as E subscript D, which when spoken, is E sub D. Consider the following additional examples. E sub M is the Armington elasticity for the allocation of imports, and E sub T is the Armington elasticity for the allocation of intermediates. Other parameters are also written as they may be spoken. Subpar and incpar are substitution and income parameters. E tray E is the elasticity of transformation between sluggish endowments. Rohrflex is the rate of return flexibility parameter, and E tray Q is the elasticity of transformation among commodities produced by activity. For more information, we have listed some useful resources. Note that if you are using a database that is consistent with the GTAP model, version 6.2 or earlier, or are simply interested in comparing the naming conventions across the different versions, you may find the video, Coefficient Naming Conventions, GTAP Classic, helpful as well. Thank you for listening to this overview of the coefficient naming conventions used in the GTAP model, version 7.